Been looking forward to this interview. Yoko Ono, An Artful Life, is a new book out by Donald Brackett. You may remember Donald came on the show a couple of weeks ago. Delighted to bring him back on to a woman, an artist who was perhaps hugely misunderstood and vilified through no fault of her own. Joining us live on the line is author of Yoko Ono, An Artful Life, Donald Brackett. Donald, good afternoon from us. Good morning to you.
Hello, Giles. How are you?
I'm very well. Good to have you back on again, as the saying goes.
Yes, and I'm so pleased to hear you playing one of my favorite Yoko songs. That little tune called Imagine.
Now, let's kick off with that to begin with, shall we?
Good place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, I mean, a lot of people just say, oh, well, this is Lennon, she's in the video, swanning around a bit in the background with the white piano, but this is obviously a Lennon song. But he admitted himself, didn't he, at some point, that she had at least co-written it.
Oh, indeed he did. In 1980, one of the last interviews he did, it was either with Playboy or, what was it, Rolling Stone maybe, or Playboy. He said that he really should have acknowledged it at the beginning, but he was too macho, as he put it, to give her the credit she needed. And then I think it was 2004 or something, she was officially listed in the publishing catalog as the co-author. But yes, my book tries to address a lot of unknown features to her life, and I think my publisher, Sutherland House Books, a little independent press in Toronto, kind of summed up what it's about in an ideal fashion. For more than 60 years, Yoko Ono has fascinated us as one of the world's most innovative, radical artists. And I would say perplexing to some, confusing to others. But from a childhood of both extraordinary privilege and extreme deprivation in wartime Japan, she adopted an outsider's persona, moved to America, where after a spell at Lawrence College, she made a place for herself in bohemian art circles. She was already, and this is the part that most people don't know, twice divorced and established as a performance artist in the Fluxus movement and also in Tokyo's avant-garde in that scene before her fortuitous meeting with the Beatles' John Lennon in 1966 in a London gallery. But from that point on, their intense and fraught relationship, which was reputed mistakenly to have blown up the Beatles, they were already, as you probably know, falling apart, and John was really falling apart, made headlines around the world. I don't think another celebrity couple was followed quite as dramatically, intensely, fetishistically as them. You know, Ava Gardner and Frank Sinatra come to mind, or Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. But they turned their whole life into really an artwork from Yoko's point of view. Through it all, and for decades after Lennon's tragic death, she remained, and this is the part I like, she remained defiantly herself. And An Artful Life charts that journey of personal turmoil, artistic evolution, activism, from the beginning to the middle to the end. And of course, she's had a longer time after John. But I think there's more than enough room in John and Yoko's history for two parallel explorations. And the world is a big enough place for both parallel insights into that peculiar but inspiring what they call Lennon magic that they both shared. And we all need more of their hopeful optimism, which was largely Yoko's, especially in today's tense times. For me, and you might recall this if you're anywhere near my age, the 2 years that stand out are 1964 and 1965, which was before the world really found out about Yoko, which was 66. But Yoko performing at Carnegie Hall in New York, doing her cut piece, and the Beatles performing on Ed Sullivan, where they were brought to much larger global acclaim. And 1965 strikes me as a huge year, still before Yoko, when Rubber Soul, one of the greatest pop albums of all time, came out. And I had a high school girlfriend back then. She was an exchange student from Japan. And she had, I guess, an innovative family. And she introduced me to Yoko's book of poems and drawings called Grapefruit, and also to the Fluxus movement that she was a huge part of. And that little book, Grapefruit, is one of the gifts that Yoko gave to John after meeting him in 66 in London. And that is what brings us to Imagine, because all through, and this is what Lennon drew people's attention to in 1980, a little late, only a decade late, but he said, when she gave me that book, it was full of dreams, poems, descriptions of what we can imagine. I mean, she had one piece in there, said, imagine there are 10,000 suns in the sky. Imagine you can walk on water. Imagine this, imagine that. Anybody who picks up this little book called Grapefruit, it's available in a Simon & Schuster edition, will be quite mesmerized and think, oh, I see, this helps me understand. So, it's the life story of an artist who did remain defiantly herself, but also something that's quite refreshing to me. Something she once said, you change the world by being yourself. Most people kind of think, or at least were taught, well, before you try to change the world, just change yourself. That wasn't her approach. She said, remain yourself, and the world will change around you. So thanks to that Japanese exchange student, who I didn't stay with, but she certainly was helpful. And the rest is certainly global history subsequent to 1996, or 66 rather. And I mean, it's just a dramatic story. They turned their life into I think it's the first reality television program.
Well, exactly.
It's reality TV.
You mentioned sort of Sinatra and Gardner, and you mentioned Burton and Taylor. Well, Sinatra and Gardner are sort of hiding away or trying to keep it quiet. And obviously,
right.
And Burton and Taylor, they're not making any statement apart from, is it cocktail hour yet? But
right.
You've got an artist embracing the media. And remember, this is still quite soon after, was it Marshall McLuhan's The Gullible Village and all that? The medium is the message.
Yep.
And she absolutely gets that. And because think about it. She's come out of Japan. She's 80 years old, so she's born at the time where there's an empire. She sees that go away. She sees Japan is devastated. She has this background which enables her to go to different places around the world, and she becomes part of that New York art scene, which is obviously, at that point, you're just coming out of the back end of the 50s, so you've already, you've got abstract expressionism. It's the place to be. Warhol's getting Factory going, and she's at the centre of this. I mean, Flexus, isn't John Cale around? Some of the Velvets are around, aren't they, this time as well?
Oh, exactly, 66. And she is really technically a pop artist. She eventually became what is known as a conceptual artist. There was no name for it at that point, but she's exactly synchronous with Andy Warhol. And she had in 1993, she's actually 90, 1933 rather, she's 90.
Wow.
And she, in 1955, she went to New York with her family, goes to this college, drops out a few years later because it wasn't experimental enough, she wasn't allowed to be free enough, but she marries, in 1955, a Japanese experimental composer, Toshi Ishiinagi, who's kind of like Toru Kakamutsu. He's a little like John Cage, very experimental. She lives with him in New York somewhere on Amsterdam Avenue. And in a way, because I believe both Yoko and the Beatles are prime examples of something philosopher Jung called archetypes, which arise in our culture and result in this sort of synchronicity, kind of meaningful coincidence, which is what their meeting felt like to them. Now, they were both extremely high when they met in that gallery, or certainly John was. He was coming down after a 3-day acid trip. But I like to think of what they were both doing at the same time. In other words, John Lennon and Yoko before they met. So in 1955, a teenage Lennon was being freaked out by Elvis Presley. And literally at the same time, a 22-year-old, because she's 8 years older than John, Yoko, was performing a piece called Lighting Piece. And she sits at a piano. She opens the piano top, and it's sort of like John Cage. She lights matches, wooden matches, and just sits there until they burn down into her fingers, and then she drops them and lights another one. Completely perplexing an audience in 1955, which, as you point out, which is also the height of the beatnik culture, and she really was the bridge between beat culture and hippie culture in a way. The other parallel that amazes me is 1957, also obviously long before their meeting, 10 years at least, when a teenage Lennon met a teenage Paul McCartney, and they fell in musical love. Yoko was already active in Tokyo and New York, at that point living with her experimental musician husband, and she embodied all the most compelling traits of avant-garde art. And she starts something rather remarkable in 1960, literally coinciding with the beginning of the decade that will kind of be forever, I guess, linked to them. 1960 to 1962, she has a series of loft exhibitions. Loft culture now, where artists have a, sort of cheap warehouse space, they turn it into a studio, they make things. But she started having exhibitions because no one would exhibit her work at that point, and performances. And in 1961, she started this loft culture thing, which is now a huge world of cultural activity. She gets divorced from Ishiganagi fairly soon, and while in Tokyo again visiting her family seems to have conspired a little bit because they were members of a kind of financial royalty. They were members of the Peer Society, and the Yasuda banking family was quite huge. They were kind of like the Rockefellers or the Kennedys in a way in Tokyo. They sort of lured her back to Tokyo because things weren't going well with Toshi. She was even in a bit of a, shall we say, in italics, a rest home for a while. Mm-hmm. And that's when her second husband, and most people don't, I'm not even sure they're aware, most people, of her second husband, Tony Cox, who goes to Japan because he's heard about the Fluxus movement, he wants to meet her. He finds a way to get her out of this so-called rest home, and they fall in love, as she often did, extremely quickly, and he becomes her second husband. He's an American sort of filmmaker, avant-garde figure, and he, with her, goes all around London doing remarkable things. And she, one of the things is the Indica Gallery in '66, where her exhibition containing the famous Yes picture with the ladder that Lennon climbed up. And that's what Lennon staggered into after his friend Paul McCartney and Robert Fraser, the really avant-garde member of the Beatles, by the way, Paul McCartney. Well, that's another talk, another time. But he stumbles in there, and the rest is just completely, he's captivated. He falls head over heels in love with her. So part of the book is trying to figure out, well, what is it that he loves so much about her? And essentially, as you probably know, by that time he was tired of the whole Beatlemania thing.
Yeah.
And some of the Beatles already wanted to break up in '66. They had stopped touring. They could make music that was only makeable or listenable in a studio. So they turned it into an art form and revolutionized pop music, of course. But he wanted out of the sort of teen idol kind of thing because he felt he was always more of an artist, a serious artist, and he didn't like entertaining people. He said he felt like a performing flea, all kinds of things like that. Didn't bother many of the other Beatles because they were, okay, we're doing pretty well here, everything's fine. But he saw in Yoko this dazzling figure, and she was quite radiantly beautiful at that point. And yes, a beatnik-looking chick and totally radical. So he identified with her and found, I think, a way out of being a Beatle. It took a few years, and along the way he was a little bit, shall we say, fragile psychologically at that time, self-induced. And he, in a way, I'm pretty sure, in fact I know, she didn't want to be in the studio all the time. And this will come as a big shock to people because anybody who's listened to her music, seen her performances or anything of that nature, the primal therapy aspect of it, she was really a shy, retiring, quiet, and actually like almost a post-traumatic stress person from being in Tokyo during the war, from seeing the firebombing of Tokyo, and from having a sort of loveless family, imperial doctrines given to her to obey. And she just went along because she somehow was necessary for him to survive, to be a whole person. And anyone who's seen the Jackson movie, Get Back, which reprises the material that Michael Lindsay Hogg did in the first Let It Be documentary, but it does it in a far more broad, and I think many people had quite a different perspective on her after seeing that. So it's rehabilitated her, and it's even helped bring back some of her art career, because far from, and you know what I'm going to say, far from her having anything to do with the Beatles breaking up, apart from being forced by her third husband to sit around and practically knit in the studio to help him get by, she didn't want to be there, but she was there, and she wrote Imagine, and she also wrote a few other of his songs.
Well, she wrote Julia, which and Julia is on the White Album, is a song which I always believed was this beautiful thing he wrote about his dead mother. Yeah,
well, it was about his dead mother, but it's also about Yoko herself, because she had become, rightly or wrongly, a maternal figure to him, as well as being a sort of having this primal passion for her. He lost his mother quite early, as you know, and it was about his mother. But if you remember the line, Julia, ocean child, La La La. Ocean Child is what Yoko means, the name.
Oh,
Yoko
wow.
means Ocean Child.
Okay.
It's kind of totally weird, and I didn't even realize it at the time. And of course, it's a lovely song about his mother, but she helped him write it, and she helped him write a lot of things just by keeping the ship upright and not sinking. So she, you know.
And here's the thing, okay? Because
what is the thing,
the
Giles?
thing with Yoko is the fact, from a British point of view, we have the Beatles, and they're all clean-cut young men who come out and they conquer America, and everybody loves them because they're lovable rogues, etc.
Right.
And like all boy bands, they get to a point where they get bored, and the whole thing. You can see all of them grating with it, as you said. McCartney likes the artwork, and Lennon, he's in his own right, he thinks of himself as a bit of a poet, a bit of an artist, the whole thing.
Sure.
And he finds himself in this relationship with his wife, with Cynthia, and it's all terribly cozy, and they're all supposed to have nice middle-class or working-class white girlfriends, and that's it, and marry a wife, and settle down like everybody else. And then, of course, you see it with Rubber Soul, which is, I was just playing it the other day, and you can just see the genesis of a change there with some of the stuff. And then we get Revolver, which is obviously a masterstroke, and then Pepper comes in, Peter Blake, pop artist, but Yoko's being pop before pop is actually a thing. And
absolutely.
So Lennon is looking for this, and he finds this, but the UK media and the UK public will not accept this because they want the Beatles to be forever young and cheeky chappies and not mature as people.
Oh, absolutely. It's there's no doubt about it. There was a certain amount of misogyny and a certain amount of racism, and just a certain amount of dumbness. Like, what business is it of ours, for instance, or yours back then, if in England, who this guy hooks up with? But of course, Cynthia was this blonde, lovely creature. They had this kid. They lived, but few people understood at that time that he was cracking under the pressure of trying to pretend to be a suburban father. And in fact, remember, he was the only one of the Beatles that lived out in the suburbs with Cynthia, and the rest of them, especially Paul, was a downtown hipster. He was going around all the galleries, and to a large degree, I think John was almost competing with Paul in terms of his knowledge of the avant-garde that Paul had. And, George didn't care. He once said that avant-garde is French for bullshit. Come on. I mean, he was pretty cheeky, like they all were. But they just, they were not able to cope with this creature. And what did she do, really? She never complained. She never said anything. She never argued. She never screamed. Well, she did scream, but that was at a different time. But it's remarkable in America, and that's why they fled in a way to America in 72 or so, because John had always felt that New York was a more, and maybe Yoko helped him feel this because she had several stints in New York for many years, and he thought he could be himself there. He thought he could walk around, which up to a point was true until you run into lunatics, of course. But, it was, and the other thing about, he was out there, and he was, most people probably know this isn't a newsflash, but he was absolutely saturated with LSD at that point.
Yeah.
He was taking eyedroppers full of LSD. But out there in the suburbs, he was looking around and seeing almost like a Disneyland world in the little estate he belonged to or lived in, and he just had to get out. And I think they're both brave people to withstand the amount of invective and venom.
He could. Well, this is the thing, because again, you've got the Beatles fans who again don't want to be anything else than cheeky chappies, who unleash this venom on them. So Yoko breaks up the Beatles. She never smiles. She's this weird artist from Japan, For Enemy, and so they go to New York and they get politically involved. Because it's the Vietnam War, it's the civil rights movement, and with the greatest of respect to the Beatles, who are brilliant. Obviously, the real crux comes offensive 68, 69, 70. Everybody else is there doing their India stuff. But, Lennon and the Plastic Ono Band and the stuff that he writes in Working Class Hero, suddenly he becomes more politically involved in New York because he can reinvent himself and be gritty again.
Oh, absolutely. He felt he was being liberated to be himself and to say what needed to be said. And she, of course, was more of a peace activist. At that point in early 71, 72, he was aligning himself with all kinds of quite radical, like Black Panthers, Jerry Rubin, Abby Hoffman. And, he was involved with the mayor campaign of Timothy Leary to become mayor of San Francisco, I think it was. And he wrote Come Together as a campaign song for Timothy Leary, which is almost mind-boggling by itself, come together from Abbey Road, which I think is their last great album. I don't really count Let It Be because it's kind of, I don't know, maudlin. I can't cope with that one. But so he fell in with a raucous crowd, and then he started having a meltdown over his marriage, even with Yoko. Started having the affair with May Pang. They went to San Francisco.
It's the Lost Weekend. They call it the Lost Weekend that lasted, a year and a bit or something, isn't it, of course?
Yeah, a year and a half, and he's out there with great pals like, Keith Moon and Harry Nilsson, who weren't exactly the most healthy playmates. But eventually he comes back, as everyone knows, to Yoko because he realizes that he doesn't really survive very well without her. And there is, to some degree, whether we like it or not, both a passionate love that he has for her, plus a slightly odd psychological attachment to her, to being, looked after by her. And of course, he couldn't look after anything financially or anything very, very coherently, so he sort of let her manage things because he didn't want to think about it. He liked to live in the clouds and in dreams, and she did too, but she also came from the Yasuda banking empire, so she was the ideal person to actually start to manage. And that, of course, freaked people out even more when around the Alan Klein time, when they were debating who should manage them, and Paul wanted Eastman, they were breaking up essentially, 69, 70. But I think if people listen to the two solo albums in 1970, the Plastic Ono band of John, Plastic Ono band of Yoko, they'll find out why. I mean, Klaus Voormann, Eric Clapton, Ringo Starr are playing on her solo record, and John is absolutely liberated. He's shredding his guitar up and down in songs like Why and Why Not. He absolutely just took flight. And 71 is, of course, an important year because it's Imagine, but Imagine isn't my favorite of his or their records. For me, 71 is all about the record called Fly, a double album by Yoko Ono, which is absolutely a staggering masterpiece. And a song called Mind Train on that contains material that wouldn't come back until like 1985 or something, like a decade and a half later. Totally visionary. That there's this dub song, and people didn't even know what dub was at that point, and absolutely staggering. The next one she made was Approximately Infinite Universe. Now, I've often felt that, far from her contributing to breaking up the Beatles, he contributed inadvertently to kind of derailing her art career slightly. Yeah. Because in a way, if you're talking about the British people or the rest of the world at that point being surprised that he hooked up with her, the art world, which would be, people like John Cage and David Tudor and all the jazz people, Ornette Coleman she played with, they were stunned that she chose him, or she allowed him to choose her, whichever it was, because they thought, well, yeah, but that's pop music. It's like completely commercial stuff. It's the best commercial stuff ever made on the planet, but, this is their perspective because they're making serious noise.
Exactly. And they're just saying, the names, Ron Coleman. I mean, people have also, there's Yoko screeching in the background, the famous Chuck Berry thing, because Chuck would never get that, the YouTube video. But, she's playing with some of the greatest jazz artists who ever walked the planet. So she knows what she is doing and the cadence and when she puts it in. And it's not an easy listen, but it's not supposed to be. Not everything has to be like Barbie.
Exactly, and that's the key to this book in a sense. What you don't know can hurt you, and it can hurt your perception of this particular artist. Because if you have no inkling at all of her first two husbands, no inkling of the avant-garde, nothing, you don't have to like that material, but you certainly have to think, well, gee, this is an important part of art history. It relates to the 1920s practically. It's the same period parallel. And if you don't know that, though, you think she's trying to sing songs. And I've tried to explain to people time and time again, mostly on Facebook by making the error of commenting or something.
Always a bad idea, my friend. But
anyway. I'm trying to stop it. But they keep saying, she's the worst singer on earth. And I keep saying, well, she's not a singer. She never claimed to be a singer. Never once have you heard her say, I'm a singer. I want to be Barbra Streisand. No. She wanted to be John Cage, or Marcel Duchamp, She wanted to be a Dadaist, and that's exactly what she was, a neo-Dadaist. And so if I say, well, think of her instead as an abstract expressionist painter using her voice as paint, people go, oh, well, okay, I'm not supposed to be literally entertained by this. No, you're not going to be lulled into like a lovely reverie or a daydream, you know. And of course, Revolution Number 9 is largely her influence on the White Album. That I'm not even sure how that ever got onto that double album, the White Album. It's a pretty remarkable tape experiment.
There's quite a few things that got onto the White Album because they didn't cut they recorded on tape and they didn't cut the tape, including, Her Majesty, which wasn't supposed to be on there at the end either. But there you go. Here's another thing as well, because, Lennon is murdered in the Dakota building, outside the Dakota building. And a couple of things happen here. I mean, Lennon is immediately, and I get a little bit cross about this whole thing when he said he becomes Saint John of Lennon, as if he was Jesus Christ incarnate walking the earth. And he wasn't, ladies and gentlemen, spoiler alert. He was a confused, mocked up human being like the rest of us. And I get really upset when people say like, oh, imagine it's no. He's, all you need is love. But B, Yoko absolutely becomes Yoko again. She doesn't do the grieving widow thing. She doesn't, she's not on reality TV. She's not doing whatever TV show saying, my life without. She just gets on with it, which is absolutely Yoko.
Oh, absolutely. She's a survivor. There's no way other way to describe her. She's a survivor. And she just, and her art career was rehabilitated after him. I think his presence was almost as grand as it was, and I adore him. I agree, he was completely messed up. Prior to her, and I think largely his relationship with her, she caused him to reevaluate his masculinity, which today we call toxic masculinity. And it really was back then. And there's lots of documentation of him having violent episodes of, apparently he killed Stu Sutcliffe, for God's sake, punched him, and after that he died, and he was always also suppressing a sort of probably a gay or at least bisexual aspect of himself, which he hated, and he was also often racist himself. I mean, a lot of his books contain quite vile things about various cultures, immigrants, and cripples. I mean, that's a complete fantasy that he was the St. John guy. He wanted to be. That's the important thing. He wanted to be, and he tried to be, and she helped him do that. And she also, I guess you could say, I don't know if capitalized is the right word, but allowed herself to be swept on this wave of celebrity with him in order to focus attention on war, peace, the climate, everything else she's done. And so she did return to the art world, and I think the first time I really saw all of her artworks together, because I was already familiar with them almost before knowing the Beatles, largely from Ed Sullivan. But there was in Toronto, 2001, I think it was, a 40-year retrospective of her artwork, a gigantic catalog that's available. It's called Yes, Yoko Ono. Anyone who wants to know the whole history of who she is, and they'll be completely stunned by what she accomplished even before being with John, and then with John, and then after John, which is why this book of mine, An Artful Life, is divided into 3 sections: before the beginning, during what I call the living movie, or the reality TV thing they were carrying on, and then after the end. So she has another 30 years or whatever it is subsequent to that. But during that time, she manages the estate, makes it grow up to like $700 million or something, and John would have just frittered it away. It's not a criticism of him. He just may as well be a romantic poet in the 19th century. Like that's what he is.
Yeah.
But she just carried on, and she's been rehabilitated. And in that exhibition, it's simply incredible when you start at the very beginning chronologically of work that she made in New York in 1957, 59 through the 60s, a whole decade before meeting him. Then she has a second husband. There are pieces from their collaborations together. He filmed some of her films. Her films, by the way, for folks listening, are worth watching, and they're mesmerizing and strange, but there's no screaming necessarily in them. Fly, for instance, is this fly walking around a nude woman's body, close-up. And there's one called Number 4, which is colloquially called Bottoms, which is like something like 250 people's derrieres. And you watch it, and watching the films that she makes, it's just eye-opening, to say the least. She was the first one to use a Sony Portapack to make a video, using a Portapack, and it was like in 1965, I think it was, and it was of the sky through the roof of the gallery. There's a camera up on top of the roof of the big museum it was at, the show, and she's shooting it up and watching clouds go by, and then the people are down there watching on the television, the video, watching these clouds go by. And of course, this is like a decade and a half before Imagine, but it's essentially the cover of Imagine with the cloud going by. And pieces were just, and then there's the collaborative pieces they did together, which I found always slightly less interesting than her work, because he was sort of riding into the art world on her coattails.
Sure, absolutely,
wasn't her doing the opposite. But there's this wonderful piece there on a pedestal called Telephone Piece. It's from 1961. I mean, literally the beginning of the 60s. And it's what do you call them, rotary telephone, nor old telephone. And every so often there's a label there that says Telephone Piece 1961, and you're sort of looking at it because it's just a telephone. But every so often during the exhibition, the 40-year retrospective, it rings. And if you're nearby, and if you have the guts, or if you're dumb enough, whatever, you pick up the phone, even though we're not supposed to do things in a museum like pick up a phone, look at something on a pedestal and touch it. So I happened to be there, and I picked it up, and Yoko was on the line. And part of the artwork is that whoever picks the phone up has a conversation with her, which is essentially what she would call a performance piece.
Live? It's not a recording. She's actually live on the line.
No, she's totally live. She calls in every so often, like every couple of days. It's random. She calls somebody. If they answer, they answer. If they don't, they don't. Because she's a Zen Buddhist, so she just lives by chance, and or the unconscious, you could say. But I picked it up, and I said, hello. And she says, are you in China? And I knew it was her because she's got this hard-to-miss little breathy voice, right?
Yeah.
She said, are you in China? And I said, no, Yoko, I'm in Toronto at the 40-year retrospective of your work called Yes, Yoko Ono. She said, oh, I'm not in China either. I said, oh, I see. So I'm following this, actually starting to sweat, thinking, I'm talking to Yoko Ono here. And I'd been sent there by an art magazine to review this retrospective. So this was the best part of it, almost. And when she said, I'm not in China either, I said, oh, well, that's fascinating. We're both not in China. And she said, so we're both in the same place.
Ooh.
And I said, we are? She said, yes, we're not in China. We're in not China. And I said, well, thank you very much for that.
That is, yeah.
And then she we hung up, and that was it. That was really a performance piece. And I thought, yeah, I mean, if both people are not in London,
we're in not London.
We're in not London.
Exactly. We're both in not London now. Amazing, yeah.
Well, exactly. One of us is in Malaga. I think you're in Malaga.
Oh, we are. Yes, in Malaga province, indeed.
Yes. Well, that was, I thought a very touching thing, and it's never left me because right in the middle of the show, and I was with my hippie pal Jerry at the time, or ex-hippie pal, because we're both older now, but. And I looked over at him, and he said, well, what just happened to you? And I said, well, I just had a out-of-body experience, And that's what all of her work really is about, seeing the everyday world in a new light, and if you pick up Grapefruit, excuse me, her little book, it's really worth getting. I think the average person is going to really love it because it's funny, it's incredibly charming. And also, the average person is going to scratch their head and say, oh, I see. Well, I see what he saw in her now, and I see the influence that she had on him. And now she's 90. I mean, she's quite frail now, and she's no longer in the Dakota building. She moved out of there. There was a big to-do around her 90th birthday, and it was outside the Dakota, and people were getting around. And she's had enough with large crowds being around singing Imagine, believe me. I mean, imagine like your husband is shot to death and people outside are singing Imagine for 3 days.
Yeah, I mean,
it's not so uplifting.
Yeah.
But she left there and she's moved now to, it's not quite an island, but it's a little place in New York, outside New York. It's like a 250-acre ranch or something. So I have a feeling it's her kind of twilight time, and she doesn't do interviews. She's very frail. She's in a wheelchair. And she just wanted to get out of her leaving the Dakota, by the way, was like a major thing. What?
Well, again, because it's the whole, this is what she should be doing. She should stay there and like Miss Havisham and never leave the building.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And well, it's she's off now, and
the book.
I guess the next thing we'll hear.
I've got to congratulate you because from going to Tina Turner to Yoko Ono, All Parts South is absolutely genius. Yoko Ono, An Artful Life is the book. It's by Donald Brackett. Donald, if people want to find you online, where can they track you down?
Just Google me. I'm everywhere. I'm on Facebook.
What are we going to talk about next? Is the next one? What else have you got in your work? Because I just love speaking with you, because it's just you always talk about empowering women one way or another. Who should we talk about next?
Well, I tend to have written these, accidentally become a specialist in fierce goddesses, I call them. I did one on Amy Winehouse, one on Sharon Jones, a soul singer, one on Tina Turner, Yoko, of course. But the next one is actually coming out in September, the next couple of months from now. And it's about the films of Charles Brackett and Billy Wilder. And yes, the name is a family relative. Charles Brackett is my great-great-grandfather's cousin. So I grew up in this distant connection.
I'm going to have to leave it there because I'm going to crash the news. Donald Brackett, thank you so much for your time today.